I still remember the exact moment I realized my sister was capable of stealing from our dead grandmother. It wasn't a dramatic revelation at first. It was quiet, almost invisible, like the first crack in a window that you don't notice until the whole thing shatters. I was standing in my grandmother's bedroom 3 days after her funeral, surrounded by the lavender scent she always wore and the faded floral wallpaper she'd had since the 1970s, and I opened her jewelry box to find it nearly empty. My grandmother, Eleanor Brennan, had been collecting jewelry her entire life. Not expensive pieces, necessarily, though some of them were worth quite a lot. But each piece had a story. The pearl necklace her mother had given her before she was evacuated during the war. The sapphire ring her husband, my grandfather, had surprised her with on their 25th wedding anniversary. The diamond and emerald brooch that had belonged to her own grandmother, passed down through 4 generations of Brennan women. And the centerpiece of her collection, the one she always said would go to her granddaughters when she passed, was a stunning Victorian diamond necklace that had been in our family for over 100 years. That jewelry box should have been overflowing. Instead, it held a few costume pieces, some tangled chains that had turned green with age, and a single pair of pearl earrings that had one missing back. I stood there for what felt like hours, my fingers trembling as I touched the velvet lining where her treasures should have been. My mother was downstairs, still accepting casseroles from neighbors and thanking people for their condolences. My sister Megan was at the funeral home, supposedly handling the final paperwork, and I was alone with the dawning realization that something was very, very wrong. Let me tell you about my grandmother first, because you need to understand what was taken to understand why what happened next mattered so much. Eleanor Brennan survived the Blitz as a child. She was sent to the countryside when she was only 7 years old, separated from her parents for 3 years, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and a photograph of her mother wearing that pearl necklace. When the war ended and she finally returned to London, her mother placed those pearls around her neck and told her that some things survive, some things endure. And from that day forward, my grandmother collected jewelry not for its monetary value, but for what it represented: survival, love, family, memory. She showed me every piece when I was a little girl. I would sit on her bed while she opened that mahogany jewelry box and told me the stories. This ring was from your grandfather when he proposed. He was so nervous he nearly dropped it in the Thames. This brooch was your great-great-grandmother's, and she wore it when she met Queen Victoria at a charity function. This necklace, Sophie, this beautiful diamond necklace, this is the heart of our family's history. She always promised that the collection would be divided between Megan and me when she passed. She even wrote it in her will, which she'd updated only 2 years before her death. To my granddaughters, Sophie and Megan, I leave my jewelry collection in its entirety, to be divided equally between them according to the inventory I have prepared and stored with my solicitor. But standing in that empty room, staring at that hollow box, I knew something had gone terribly wrong. I didn't immediately suspect my sister. I want you to understand that. Despite everything that happened, despite everything I'm about to tell you, Megan was my older sister. She taught me how to ride a bike. She held my hand at our grandfather's funeral when I was 12 years old and couldn't stop crying. She was the one who flew to London from Manchester when my first serious relationship ended and I couldn't get out of bed for a week. She was my sister, and I loved her, and the idea that she could betray our grandmother's memory and steal from both of us was something I couldn't immediately accept. So I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Gran had given the jewelry away before she died. Maybe she'd sold some pieces to pay for her care. Maybe she'd hidden them somewhere else in the house for safekeeping. I spent the rest of that day searching. I went through every drawer, every closet, every box in the attic. I checked the safe my grandmother had installed years ago, but it was empty except for old documents and a few photographs. I looked in places that made no sense, behind paintings, under floorboards, inside old handbags. I found nothing. When my mother came upstairs that evening, exhausted from grief and the endless stream of visitors, I showed her the jewelry box. I watched the color drain from her face as she realized what I was showing her. "Where is it all, Mom?" I asked. "Where is Gran's jewelry?" My mother sank onto the bed, her hand pressed to her chest. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't understand. She had so many beautiful things." We sat there together in stunned silence. My mother suggested that perhaps Gran had given things away to charity or to friends, but she didn't sound convinced. Gran had been sharp until the very end. She'd updated her will only 2 years ago, specifically mentioning the jewelry inventory with her solicitor. Why would she do that if she'd already given everything away? I called the solicitor the next morning. Mr. Patterson was a kind man who had known our family for decades, and he was shocked when I told him what we'd discovered. He confirmed that Eleanor had indeed prepared a detailed inventory of her jewelry collection, which she'd updated annually. The most recent version, dated only 8 months before her death, listed 47 pieces with a combined estimated value of nearly £90,000. £90,000! That's what had disappeared from that jewelry box. Mr. Patterson sent me a copy of the inventory, and I spent that night going through it with my mother. Every piece was described in my grandmother's careful handwriting, with notes about its history and meaning. The Victorian diamond necklace alone was valued at £35,000. The sapphire ring was worth $12,000. The pearl necklace, the one her mother had given her before the war, was estimated at $8,000, and all of it was gone. My mother wanted to contact the police immediately. Someone had clearly broken in and stolen the jewelry, she said. We needed to report it. But something made me hesitate. Something about the situation didn't feel right for a burglary. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. Nothing else was missing. Not the silver, not the antique furniture, not the cash my grandmother had kept in an envelope in her kitchen drawer for emergencies. Just the jewelry. And then there was the matter of access. My grandmother had been very particular about who had keys to her house. She'd given one to my mother, one to me, and one to Megan. That was it. Even her brother, my great-uncle Peter, had to call ahead if he wanted to visit. If someone had stolen the jewelry, they'd either picked a lock without leaving a mark, or they'd had a key. I called Megan that night to tell her what we'd discovered. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding distracted. She was at her fiancé, Daniel's flat, she said, going over wedding preparations. They were getting married in 4 months, and there was still so much to do. "Megan, Gran's jewelry is gone," I said. "All of it." There was a pause, a long one. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded strange, a bit too casual. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean, it's not there. The jewelry box is practically empty. Mom and I have searched everywhere. The inventory Mr. Patterson has lists nearly £90,000 worth of pieces, and none of them are in the house." Another pause. "That's mad," she said. "Are you sure she didn't give it away? You know how she was always donating things to charity." "She updated her inventory 8 months ago, Megan. She clearly intended for us to have it. It's in her will." "Well, maybe she put it in a safety deposit box. Did you check with her bank?" I hadn't thought of that. I thanked her for the suggestion and said I would look into it. But as I hung up the phone, I felt a cold sensation creeping through my chest. Something about her voice. Something about those pauses. Something about the way she'd immediately started suggesting explanations instead of expressing shock or outrage. I told myself I was being paranoid. Grief does strange things to people, and I was grieving. We all were. The bank confirmed the next day that my grandmother did not have a safety deposit box with them. She never had. I called 3 other banks in the area with the same result. Wherever the jewelry had gone, it wasn't sitting in a vault somewhere waiting to be claimed. My mother filed a police report, more for insurance purposes than anything else. Gran had a policy on her jewelry, and we would need the report to make a claim. The officer who came to take our statement was sympathetic but not optimistic. Without any sign of forced entry, without any witnesses, without any evidence of when the theft might have occurred, there wasn't much they could do. They would keep the file open, but we shouldn't expect results. The funeral was on a Tuesday. By the following Monday, I was back at work in London, trying to focus on campaigns and client meetings while my mind kept returning to that empty jewelry box. My mother called every evening with updates, which were really just confirmations that nothing had changed. No leads, no discoveries, no jewelry. And then, 3 weeks after my grandmother's death, I received a photograph that changed everything. It came from my Auntie Patricia, my grandmother's only surviving sibling. Patricia lived in Edinburgh and hadn't been able to make it to the funeral due to her own health issues, but she'd been going through old photographs of Eleanor and wanted to share some with the family. She'd sent a group email to everyone, attaching dozens of images from throughout my grandmother's life. I opened them during my lunch break, smiling sadly at pictures of Gran as a young woman, as a bride, as a mother holding my infant mother in her arms. And then I reached a photograph from what looked like a holiday party, dated just 18 months ago. Gran was sitting in an armchair, surrounded by family, wearing her favorite burgundy cardigan, and around her neck, clearly visible, even in this somewhat blurry phone camera image, was the Victorian diamond necklace. That wasn't what made me gasp. What made me gasp was who was sitting beside her. Megan was leaning in close to Gran, one arm around her shoulders, smiling brightly at the camera, and she was staring directly at the necklace. Not just glancing at it, staring at it. There was something hungry in her expression, something I had never noticed before. I studied that photograph for a long time. I enlarged it, examined every detail, and I noticed something else. Megan was wearing a new designer handbag, one I remembered her showing off at that party. She'd said it was a gift from Daniel. But I also remembered, now that I was thinking about it, that Megan had been having money troubles around that time. She'd borrowed £300 for me only a month before that party, saying her rent was late and she'd pay me back as soon as she got her commission check. She never did pay me back, though I'd never pushed her about it. A designer handbag cost several £1,000s. How had she afforded it if she couldn't make rent? I started thinking back, really thinking, about Megan's financial situation over the past year. She worked as an estate agent in Manchester, and while she'd always talked about how well she was doing, I realized I'd never actually seen evidence of success. She drove a nice car, but was always complaining about the payments. She wore expensive clothes, but often asked to borrow money between paydays. She was planning an elaborate wedding, but had mentioned several times that Daniel was handling most of the costs. Daniel Whitmore was a property developer who Megan had been dating for about 2 years. He was handsome in a slick, manufactured way, with perfectly styled hair and an overly firm handshake. I had never particularly liked him, though I couldn't have told you why. He seemed nice enough, attentive to Megan, always saying the right things, but there was something about his eyes, something calculating, something that made me feel like he was always assessing people, figuring out their value. I started doing something I'm not particularly proud of. I started researching my own sister. It's not hard in the digital age to find information about someone's life. Social media posts, LinkedIn profiles, public records. Within a few hours, I had learned that Megan's estate agency had been struggling. Several of her colleagues had been made redundant in the past year, and while she still had a job, it seemed like she was barely holding on. I found a county court judgment against her from 2 years ago for an unpaid credit card bill. I found evidence that she'd moved flats 3 times in 3 years, each time to somewhere slightly smaller and less expensive. My sister was in financial trouble, serious financial trouble, and she was about to marry a man who projected wealth and success at every opportunity. I thought about Daniel's property development company. I searched for it online. Whitmore Developments had a flashy website with impressive-looking project photos, but when I dug deeper, I found that most of their projects were either stalled or had been delayed indefinitely. There were complaints on business review sites from subcontractors who hadn't been paid. There was a news article from a local paper about a housing development that had been abandoned mid-construction, leaving buyers without their deposits. Daniel Whitmore wasn't a successful developer. He was barely hanging on. So here were 2 people, my sister and her fiancé, both pretending to be successful while drowning in financial problems. And 90,000 pounds worth of jewelry had disappeared from our grandmother's house. I didn't want to believe it. Even with all this circumstantial evidence pointing in one direction, I couldn't make myself believe that Megan would steal from our grandmother, that she would steal from our family, that she would look me in the eyes and suggest checking safety deposit boxes when she knew perfectly well where the jewelry had gone. But I also couldn't ignore what I was seeing. I needed proof, real proof, something that would show me definitively whether my suspicions were correct or whether I was just being paranoid. I started paying closer attention during our family phone calls. Megan called me every few days, always asking about the jewelry situation with what I now recognized as carefully calibrated concern. She had theories and suggestions, always pointing away from herself. Maybe Gran had given things to her carers. Maybe there was another family member who had access we didn't know about. Maybe the jewelry had been fake all along, and Gran had secretly sold the real pieces years ago. Each suggestion felt like a test, like she was gauging my reaction, trying to determine if I suspected anything. 2 months after the funeral, my mother called with news. The insurance company had completed their investigation and were declining the claim. Without evidence of forced entry and without any police progress on the case, they said there was no proof that a theft had occurred. For all they knew, the inventory was inaccurate or the jewelry had been voluntarily disposed of before my grandmother's death. Megan's reaction when I told her was interesting. She was outraged, absolutely furious, demanding that we get a lawyer and sue the insurance company. It seemed like a disproportionate response for someone who hadn't seemed particularly invested in finding the jewelry. But it made perfect sense if she was trying to establish herself as a victim of the situation rather than its perpetrator. I was becoming more certain by the day, but certainty wasn't proof. My opportunity came unexpectedly, about 3 months after Gran's death. Megan had asked me to come to Manchester for a wedding dress fitting. She wanted my opinion, she said. She wanted me to be part of the process. I agreed immediately, seeing an opportunity I couldn't pass up. I arrived the evening before the fitting and stayed at Megan's flat. Daniel was away on business, she said, looking at a property development in Spain. The flat was nicer than I expected, given what I knew about her finances, but I noticed she was careful to keep certain doors closed and seemed nervous whenever I walked toward the bedroom. After dinner, Megan opened a bottle of wine, then another. She was stressed about the wedding, she said. There was so much to organize, and Daniel was no help at all. He kept promising money would come through for various things, but it never seemed to materialize. She was carrying most of the costs on her credit cards. It was the first honest thing she'd said to me in months. I played sympathetic. I asked gentle questions about Daniel's business. She sighed and admitted things weren't going well. There was some problem with financing for a big project, and everything was on hold until it was sorted. But it would be fine, she said with forced optimism. Daniel had investors lined up. It would all come together. She went to bed around 11, wine-sleepy and a bit melancholic. I waited an hour until I heard her snoring through the bedroom door. Then I did something I never thought I would do. I searched my sister's flat. I justified it to myself in 100 ways. The jewelry wasn't hers. If she had taken it, she had stolen from me too. From my mother, from our grandmother's memory. I had a right to know the truth. The living room yielded nothing unusual. Neither did the kitchen or the bathroom. But when I crept into the spare bedroom, the one she used as a home office, I found something interesting. A locked filing cabinet. I knew where she kept her keys. She'd always been predictable about that, throwing them in a bowl by the front door. I retrieved them as quietly as I could and tried each one until I found the match. Inside the filing cabinet were bank statements, credit card bills, loan documents, and at the very bottom, a folder labeled simply M. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photographs, not of Megan, of jewelry, my grandmother's jewelry, photographed against a white background with clinical precision. Each image was labeled with a date and a number. The dates ranged from 18 months ago to just 2 months before my grandmother's death. She hadn't stolen it all at once. She'd been taking pieces gradually, over more than a year, photographing each one before presumably selling it. Beneath the photographs were receipts from antique jewelry dealers in Manchester, Liverpool, and London, consignment agreements, payment confirmations. She'd been meticulous about documenting everything, probably to track her income from the sales. There was a spreadsheet, handwritten, totaling the amounts. £63,000. She'd sold £63,000 worth of our grandmother's jewelry while Gran was still alive. But wait, the inventory had been worth $90,000. Where were the remaining pieces? I photographed everything in that folder. Every receipt, every consignment agreement, every handwritten note. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone steady, but I forced myself to be thorough. When I was done, I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, locked the cabinet, returned the keys to their bowl, and went to the guest bedroom to lie awake until morning. The wedding dress fitting the next day was surreal. I sat in the bridal boutique, watching my sister twirl in white silk and lace, while the images from that folder burned in my mind. She looked beautiful and happy and completely at ease. There was no guilt in her eyes when she looked at me, no shame when she talked about how she couldn't wait to inherit Gran's Victorian necklace, how she'd always imagined wearing it on her wedding day. She didn't know the necklace was gone because she'd sold it months ago. She was just performing the role of grieving granddaughter, establishing her expectations so that when the jewelry never turned up, she could play the disappointed victim alongside the rest of us. I said all the right things. I smiled and complimented the dress and helped her choose accessories. But inside, something had shifted permanently. The sister I knew was gone, maybe had never really existed. In her place was a stranger who had stolen from a dying woman and lied to everyone who loved her. I went back to London that evening and started planning. Revenge is an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as justice. My grandmother had wanted Megan and me to share her jewelry collection equally. She'd taken the time to inventory every piece, to write detailed notes about their history and meaning. She'd trusted us to honor her memory, and Megan had violated that trust in the worst possible way. But I couldn't just go to the police with what I'd found. I'd obtained the evidence through what they would consider an illegal search. Even if they believed me, even if they pursued charges, A defense lawyer would have a field day with how the evidence was discovered. Megan might face consequences, or she might walk free while I was charged with burglary. No, I needed to handle this carefully. I needed to expose Megan in a way that was undeniable, public, and permanent. And I needed to do it without breaking any laws myself. The wedding was in 6 weeks. I had 6 weeks to plan. My first step was gathering more evidence through legitimate means. I went back through family photographs, looking for images of Gran wearing her jewelry. I found dozens, spanning years, and in each one I noted which pieces she was wearing and when. I created a timeline showing that the jewelry had existed and had been in her possession until relatively recently. Then I contacted the jewelry dealers whose receipts I'd photographed. I didn't identify myself as Megan's sister. Instead, I posed as a researcher writing about Victorian jewelry and asked about their recent acquisitions. 2 of them were happy to talk about pieces they'd purchased from a private seller in Manchester. One even mentioned that the seller had brought in multiple pieces over the course of more than a year. I asked if they had photographs of the pieces. One dealer did. He sent them to me, clearly showing my grandmother's sapphire ring and pearl necklace, among others. I now had independent verification that Megan had sold the jewelry, but I still didn't know where the remaining pieces were. The most valuable item, the Victorian diamond necklace, wasn't among the photographed sales. A thought occurred to me. The most valuable piece. The one Megan had always coveted most. The one she'd mentioned wanting to wear on her wedding day. She'd kept it. She was planning to wear it at her wedding. The audacity of it took my breath away. She was going to walk down the aisle wearing a necklace she'd stolen from our grandmother in front of our entire family and pretend it was hers. She was counting on the fact that no one would question a bride wearing an heirloom on her wedding day. I considered, briefly, confronting her privately, demanding the return of the jewelry or at least the remaining pieces, threatening to expose her if she didn't comply, but that would give her warning. She'd hide the evidence, create explanations, maybe even turn the situation around to make me look like the villain. No, I had learned something important about my sister in the past few months. She was a skilled manipulator. She'd been lying to everyone for years, and no one had suspected a thing. If I gave her any advance warning, she would find a way to spin the narrative in her favor. The only way to expose her was to catch her in the act, in front of witnesses, with evidence she couldn't deny. The wedding was going to be at a country house hotel in Cheshire, a beautiful old manor with gardens and a chapel and enough grandeur to impress the 200 guests Megan had invited. Half of those guests were family, including aunts, uncles, and cousins who had known and loved our grandmother. The other half were Daniel's business associates and friends, people whose good opinion was valuable to him. I started making phone calls. Auntie Patricia was the first person I contacted. She was sharp, suspicious by nature, and had always been protective of Eleanor. When I told her what I'd discovered, she went silent for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I always knew there was something wrong with that girl." She didn't mean Megan was evil. She meant there was a falseness to her, something performative and calculated that Patricia had sensed but never been able to articulate. She'd watched Megan manipulate their mother for extra attention, extra money, extra favors. She'd watched her charm people into giving her what she wanted while never really caring about them as individuals. Patricia agreed to help me. So did my mother when I finally told her everything. She cried for hours, not just from grief, but from the betrayal. Her own daughter had been stealing from her mother while she was alive, had probably accelerated her death through the stress of realizing things were missing but not being able to prove it. That was something I hadn't considered. My grandmother had mild dementia toward the end. Everyone had assumed that's why she sometimes seemed confused about her possessions, why she would search for things and become upset when she couldn't find them. But what if it wasn't the dementia at all? What if she'd noticed pieces going missing and simply been unable to articulate what was happening or make anyone believe her? The thought of my grandmother, alone and confused, watching her treasures disappear without being able to stop it, made my blood run cold. 4 weeks before the wedding, I did something risky. I went back to Manchester under the pretense of helping with final preparations, and while Megan was out at a meeting with the caterers, I searched her flat again. I found the Victoria necklace hidden in her closet, tucked inside a hat box on the top shelf. It was in a velvet pouch, exactly as my grandmother had always stored it. I took photographs from every angle, documenting its current location and condition. Then I found something else that stopped my heart. A small leather journal that had belonged to my grandmother. Inside were notes in Gran's handwriting, increasingly distressed as time went on. Things are going missing. Megan visited and the pearl earrings are gone. I must be imagining things. And later, dated only 6 months before her death, Megan took the sapphire ring. I saw her put it in her bag. But no one believes me. They think I'm losing my mind. My grandmother had known. She'd known exactly what was happening, and she'd been dismissed as confused, as demented, as unreliable. Megan had used Gran's illness as cover for her theft, counting on no one believing the accusations of an old woman with memory problems. I photographed every page of that journal. Then I put it back exactly where I'd found it. 3 weeks before the wedding, I received an unexpected gift. One of the jewelry dealers I'd contacted reached out to me again. He'd been cleaning up his records and had found something he thought I might find interesting. A video, actually. His shop had security cameras, and he'd kept the footage from the day a particular piece was sold. I watched the video with my mother beside me. We saw Megan walk into the shop carrying a small bag. We saw her take out the sapphire ring and negotiate a price. We saw money change hands. We saw her smile and leave. The date stamp was clearly visible. It was during a week when Megan had claimed to be visiting our grandmother to help with her care. We now had video evidence. Combined with the photographs, the receipts, the journal, and the testimony of the dealers, we had an airtight case. But I still wanted the public exposure. I wanted Megan to face her family, to have the truth revealed in front of everyone she'd lied to. I wanted the humiliation to be as complete as the betrayal had been. I started coordinating with Auntie Patricia and the other family members I'd brought into my confidence. We developed a plan that would unfold at the wedding itself, timed precisely to create maximum impact. The week before the wedding, I did one final piece of preparation. I hired a private investigator to look into Daniel Whitmore. What he found was even worse than I'd expected. Daniel wasn't just a struggling property developer. He was actively running a fraud scheme. His company had taken deposits from buyers for properties that were never going to be built, then used that money to fund his lifestyle while stringing investors along with promises of future returns. There were at least 8 families who had lost their life savings to his schemes. Moreover, Daniel was married. His divorce had never been finalized because his wife refused to sign the papers until he paid child support he owed for their 2 children. He'd been lying to Megan about his marital status for their entire relationship. I almost felt sorry for my sister. Almost. Then I remembered my grandmother's journal, her confusion and distress as her treasures disappeared, and my sympathy evaporated. The wedding day arrived. I woke up at dawn, too anxious to sleep. I went through my preparations one more time, checking that everything was in place. The evidence packages I'd prepared, the signals I'd coordinated with Patricia and my mother, the video equipment that a trusted cousin had agreed to set up, ostensibly to capture the ceremony, but really to document what was about to happen. I arrived at the venue early, dressed as a bridesmaid, smiling at everyone I passed. Megan was in the bridal suite, surrounded by her friends and our mother, who was playing her role perfectly. She complimented Megan's dress, helped with her makeup, and gave no indication that anything was wrong. I went to see Megan about an hour before the ceremony. She was standing in front of a full-length mirror, already in her gown, looking genuinely radiant, and around her neck was the Victorian diamond necklace. She caught my eye in the mirror and smiled. "I found it," she said. "Can you believe it? I was going through Grand's things, and there it was, tucked away in a box I'd missed before. I know we were supposed to share the jewelry, but I just had to wear this today. You understand, don't you? You can have it after the wedding." The lies came so easily to her, so smoothly. She'd practiced this moment, I realized. She'd anticipated having to explain why she was wearing the necklace and had prepared a story that made her look innocent while also establishing that she intended to keep it. "It's beautiful," I said. "Gran would have loved seeing you wear it." She gave me a brilliant smile, and I returned it, knowing what was coming. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Guests began arriving around 1:30, filling the chapel with chatter and laughter. Daniel stood at the altar, handsome in his tailored suit, looking every inch the successful businessman he pretended to be. His groomsmen flanked him, none of them aware that their friend was a fraudster and a bigamist. I took my place with the other bridesmaids. My mother sat in the front row, clutching a handkerchief. Auntie Patricia sat beside her, her eyes sharp and watchful. The music started, the doors opened, and Megan walked down the aisle on my uncle's arm, a vision in white silk with diamonds glittering at her throat. The ceremony proceeded normally. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed on fingers. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, though of course that wasn't legally accurate since Daniel was already married. They kissed, the guests applauded, and everyone filed out of the chapel toward the reception in the main hall. This was when the real wedding would begin. The reception was scheduled to start with speeches before dinner. Daniel's best man was supposed to go first, followed by my uncle as the father figure giving Megan away, and then Daniel himself. What no one except my co-conspirators knew was that there would be an additional speech. I waited until everyone was seated, champagne flutes in hand, ready to toast the happy couple. The best man stood up and delivered a predictable but inoffensive speech about what a great guy Daniel was, how lucky Megan was to have found him. There was applause, laughter, all the expected responses. My uncle stood next. He talked about watching Megan grow up, about how proud the family was of her. He got a bit teary when he mentioned my grandmother, saying how much Eleanor would have loved to see this day. Megan dabbed at her eyes, the perfect picture of a loving granddaughter. Then, before Daniel could rise for his speech, I stood up. The room went quiet. People looked confused. This wasn't in the program. Megan's smile flickered, just slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I hope you don't mind," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "but before we continue, I have something I need to share, something about family and legacy and truth." Megan's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what. "Most of you knew my grandmother, Eleanor Brennan," I continued. "She was a remarkable woman who survived the war, raised a family, and collected jewelry that told the story of her life. When she passed away 3 months ago, she left those pieces to her granddaughters, to me, and to Megan." I paused, letting the silence stretch. But when we went to collect that inheritance, we found almost nothing. 90,000 pounds worth of jewelry had vanished. We reported it to the police. We filed an insurance claim. We searched everywhere. And we couldn't understand what had happened. Megan was very still now. Her smile had frozen on her face. Until I found this. I pulled out a stack of photographs and began passing them around the room. The images from the dealers, the receipts, the pages from my grandmother's journal, photographed and printed. These are photos taken by jewelry dealers in Manchester and Liverpool, showing pieces they purchased from a private seller over the past year and a half. I gestured to one particularly clear image. That's my grandmother's sapphire ring. It was worth £12,000. She wore it every day until it disappeared. The murmuring started. People were looking at the photos, passing them around, their expressions shifting from confusion to concern. And this, I continued, is a page from my grandmother's journal. She wrote it 6 months before she died. I'll read it aloud. Megan took the sapphire ring. I saw her put it in her bag, but no one believes me. They think I'm losing my mind. The murmuring became louder. Megan's face had gone pale. For over a year, my sister visited our grandmother regularly, not to care for her, as she told everyone, but to steal from her. Piece by piece, she took jewelry that had been in our family for generations and sold it to fund her lifestyle and impress her fiancé. Sophie, that's enough. Megan's voice was sharp, cutting through the noise. You're embarrassing yourself. Whatever you think you found, you're wrong. Am I? I pointed to the necklace around her neck. Tell me where you got that necklace, Megan. She touched it reflexively. I told you, I found it in Gran's things. That's interesting, because according to this inventory my grandmother filed with her solicitor, that necklace was stored in her mahogany jewelry box, the same jewelry box that was nearly empty when we opened it after the funeral. If you found it in her things, why didn't you mention it to anyone? Why didn't you tell Mum or me? Why did you wait until today to suddenly produce it? Megan's mouth opened and closed. She was searching for an explanation, her eyes darting around the room. I found it recently, she said. I was doing a final check of her house before it sold, and there it was. Gran's house hasn't been shown to any buyers yet. The estate isn't even on the market. I've checked. The room was completely silent now. Every eye was on Megan. Her friends looked horrified. Her colleagues from work were exchanging glances. And Daniel, beside her, had gone very pale indeed. I have one more piece of evidence, I said, pulling out my phone. This is security footage from a jewelry shop in Manchester dated 14 months ago. I connected the phone to the venue's sound system. My cousin had helped me set up the connection earlier. The video played on the large screen that had been meant for wedding photos and messages. Everyone watched as Megan walked into the shop, took out the sapphire ring, negotiated, and left with cash in hand. The date stamp was clear. The identification was unmistakable. When the video ended, I turned back to face the room. My sister stole from our dying grandmother. She used our grandmother's dementia as cover, knowing no one would believe an old woman with memory problems. She sold almost £60,000 worth of jewelry and kept the most valuable piece for herself, planning to wear it on her wedding day as if it were rightfully hers. Megan was crying now, but not the pretty tears of a bride. These were ugly tears, the tears of someone who had been caught. Sophie, please, she whispered. I can explain. I was going to pay it back. Daniel and I were having trouble, and I just needed to bridge some gaps until things turned around. Daniel spoke for the first time. What do you mean, we were having trouble? I turned to him, knowing this was my chance to deliver the second blow. That's actually something you should know about, Daniel. I hired a private investigator to look into your business dealings. He found some very interesting things. Daniel went from pale to gray. His grip on his champagne flute tightened until I thought it might shatter. Whitmore Developments has taken deposits from at least 8 families for properties that were never going to be built. The money has been used to fund your lifestyle, not construction. There are people who have lost their life savings to your schemes. The murmuring became a roar. Daniel's business associates were looking at each other with alarm. His groomsmen were backing away from him. But that's not the most interesting part, I continued. The most interesting part is that Daniel Whitmore is still married. His divorce was never finalized because his wife refused to sign until he paid the child support he owes for his 2 children. The room exploded. Megan turned on Daniel, her face contorted with rage. "You're married? You have children?" Daniel was already moving toward the door. "This is ridiculous. I'm not staying to listen to these lies." "They're not lies," I called after him. "The private investigator has documentation. It's already been shared with the fraud investigation unit. They'll be very interested to speak with you." Daniel didn't stop. He pushed through the crowd and was gone, leaving his bride standing at the altar with stolen diamonds around her neck and 200 witnesses to her humiliation. In the chaos that followed, Auntie Patricia stood up and walked to Megan. Without a word, she reached up and unclasped the Victorian necklace, removing it from my sister's neck. Megan didn't resist. She was sobbing too hard to do anything. Patricia held up the necklace for everyone to see. "This belonged to my mother," she said, her voice ringing clearly over the noise. "It has been in our family for 4 generations. It was meant to be shared by Eleanor's granddaughters, passed down to their children and grandchildren. Instead, it was stolen by a thief." She placed the necklace in my mother's hands. "Claire, I believe this belongs to Sophie now. Megan has forfeited any claim to Eleanor's legacy." The reception never happened, not as planned anyway. The guests scattered, most of them too shocked to do anything but leave. Megan disappeared into the bridal suite and didn't emerge for hours. When she finally did, she was escorted out by my mother, who drove her to a hotel and left her there. The fallout was swift and comprehensive. Daniel was arrested 3 days later on fraud charges. His company's assets were frozen, and an investigation was opened into all of his business dealings. His wife, learning where he was, filed for immediate divorce on grounds of abandonment and provided testimony about his financial abuses during their marriage. He was looking at years in prison. Megan was not arrested, at least not immediately. The jewelry theft was complicated by the fact that some of it had occurred while my grandmother was still alive, making the ownership questions murky. But when the details came out, when the full extent of her betrayal was revealed, she lost everything that mattered to her. Her employer, learning about the theft and her relationship with a fraudster, terminated her immediately. Her friends, the ones who had stood beside her at the wedding, cut her off completely. Her reputation in the Manchester property world was destroyed. No one would hire her. No one would work with her. No one would trust her. Our family divided along predictable lines. Most people sided with me and my mother. A few, mostly distant relatives who hadn't known Gran well, thought I'd been too harsh, but even they couldn't defend what Megan had done. The jewelry that had been sold was largely unrecoverable. The dealers had purchased it in good faith and resold it to private collectors who couldn't be traced. The insurance company, presented with the new evidence, agreed to pay out a portion of the claim, but it was only a fraction of what the collection had been worth. But we had the Victorian necklace. We had the pearls that Patricia had managed to track down through one of the dealers who was willing to cooperate, and we had the truth. 6 months after the wedding that never was, I received a letter from Megan. I expected excuses, justifications, maybe even threats. Instead, it was a confession. She wrote about how the theft had started. She'd been desperate for money, drowning in debt, and Daniel had been pressuring her to keep up appearances. She'd taken one piece, just one, telling herself she would pay it back. But then Daniel had needed more, and she'd taken another, and somehow she'd convinced herself that Gran wouldn't notice, that it didn't really matter, that the jewelry would have been hers eventually anyway. She wrote about the guilt, how she couldn't sleep, how she'd had nightmares about Gran's face, disappointed and sad, how she'd almost confessed a dozen times but could never find the courage. She wrote about the wedding day, how part of her had been relieved when I stood up because she'd known for months that the lies were unsustainable and at least now it was over. And she wrote about what she wanted. Not forgiveness, she said. She knew she didn't deserve that, but understanding, a chance to explain, a relationship with our mother who had cut her off completely. I read that letter 3 times. Then I folded it up and put it in a drawer with my grandmother's journal. Understanding is not the same as forgiveness, and some betrayals cannot be undone with words. A year after my grandmother's death, I sat in my London flat with the Victorian necklace in my hands. It was even more beautiful than I remembered, the diamonds catching the light and throwing rainbows across the walls. I thought about Gran, about the stories she'd told me when I was a little girl, about survival and endurance and the things that matter more than money. She'd wanted this necklace to be shared, to connect her granddaughters to each other and to the generations who had come before. But some connections are broken beyond repair, and some truths, once revealed, cannot be unseen. I donated the necklace to a museum in London that specialized in Victorian jewelry. I told them its history, all of it, and they created a display with a small plaque explaining that it had been donated in memory of Eleanor Brennan, a woman who believed that some things survive, some things endure. The sapphire ring, which Patricia had recovered, went to my mother. She wears it every day on the same finger where Gran used to wear it. The pearl necklace, the one that had traveled with a 7-year-old girl to the countryside during the war, was given to Auntie Patricia herself. She'd always loved it most, and Gran would have wanted her to have it. I kept only one piece for myself, a simple gold locket that had belonged to Gran's mother, with a tiny photograph inside of a woman I never knew, but whose blood runs in my veins. It's not worth much monetarily, but every time I touch it, I feel connected to something larger than myself. 2 years have passed since my grandmother's death. 2 years since I stood in her bedroom and realized something was terribly wrong. 2 years since I began the investigation that would expose my sister's betrayal and destroy her carefully constructed life. Megan lives in a small flat now, in a part of Manchester that's very different from the neighborhoods she used to show to clients. She works at a retail shop, minimum wage, trying to pay off the debts that accumulated during her years of pretending. She has no friends from her old life, no professional connections, no romantic prospects. I don't feel sorry for her. I want to be clear about that. What she did was unforgivable, and the consequences she's facing are exactly what she deserves. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about the sister she used to be, the one who taught me to ride a bike, the one who held my hand at grandfather's funeral, the one who flew to London when my heart was broken. Was that person ever real? Or was she always just a mask, a performance designed to make people trust her while she calculated how to use them? I don't know. I'll probably never know. What I do know is that the truth matters, that lies, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually collapse under their own weight, that the people who deceive you will always, in the end, reveal themselves, and I know that some things survive. Some things endure. My grandmother was right about that. The jewelry is scattered now, some of it lost forever, sold to strangers who will never know its history. Some of it in museums and collections, preserved for future generations to admire. Some of it with the people who loved Gran most and will carry her memory forward. And the thief? The thief exposed herself at the wedding, just as I knew she would. She couldn't resist wearing that necklace, couldn't resist the final, ultimate betrayal of walking down the aisle adorned in stolen diamonds. Pride goes before a fall, Gran used to say. She was quoting the Bible, I think, though she was never particularly religious. She was right about that, too. Some betrayals are too deep for forgiveness, but the truth, once spoken, sets you free. It took me 3 months to uncover what my sister had done. It took me 3 minutes to expose her in front of everyone she'd ever tried to impress. And now, when I touch the gold locket around my neck, I think of Gran. I think of survival and endurance and the things that truly matter. I think of justice served. And I feel, finally, at peace.